Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just say to the 24%, the Congressional Budget Office, as former OMB Director Jack Lew knows, just told us last week that we're quickly going to 25 and then 30 and then 35 and then in the year 2042, 40% of GDP. So clearly not sustainable. And CBO also made the point that you simply can't catch that level of spending with new taxes, at least under the income tax code. So as Treasury Secretary, you're going to have the opportunity to deploy all those OMB skills, and I would agree with Senator Cornyn that we need to establish, what is the right level of government, and then be sure that our budget is balanced over time. CBO tells us that revenue is going to exceed its historic average, as you know, in the next few years by 2015. But let me back up on a question that I'd like to ask you today regarding corporate tax reform and individual tax reform. Last night at the State of the Union, the President said a lot of things, and again, as a former OMB Director, I hope you were at least a little uncomfortable with his laying out what I counted as 10 new federal spending programs. I want to ask you today how we're spending, how we're going to pay for those. The President said not a dime in the deficit, which I guess means higher taxes. But he did say some things I thought were very promising about reform, and that was with regard to tax reform and entitlement reform. And he also said something that I appreciated, which is it's not going to be easy. And I think it's part of his role as President, and your role, should you become Treasury Secretary, is to lay this out for the American people in a way, as we just talked about, the current spending level is unsustainable. We do have to reform these important, vital programs so that they are there for future generations. With regard to tax reform, as you and I have talked about, I believe it's a huge opportunity to give the economy a shot in the arm. Senator Hatch talked about it, Senator Baucus talked about it in his comments and questions to you, Senator Crapo, Senator Thune, and others. But I'd like to dig a little deeper if I could, because I really think this is an area where we can both see strong economic growth and also, frankly, find a consensus here between the administration and the Congress on a nonpartisan basis almost, because I think it's one that we all agree needs to be done. In '86, back when you were here on the Hill and Ronald Reagan was working on tax reform, we lowered the corporate rate from 46% to 34%, 27 years ago. And we did that very deliberately to get our corporate rate below the average of our competitors. In the intervening 27 years, every single one of our competitors, all of them, have not just lowered their rates but reformed their corporate tax code, except us. And that puts us at a clear competitive disadvantage. We're sitting on the sidelines while investment in jobs and headquarters are going overseas. We can talk more about that. But here's a quote that I like. It's from the Secretary of the Treasury equivalent, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK. He says, the headline rate of corporate tax remains the most visible sign of how competitive our country is. By 2014, Britain will have a 22% rate, headline rate that is not lower than all of our competitors, but dramatically lower, 18% lower than the U.S. So this is what's going on. They're all lowering their rates, and they're all reforming their code to make it more competitive, except us. We talked earlier about our rate being 39.2 as an average. That's the corporate rate when you include the state and the federal rate, which is 14 points above the OECD average. You made the point that, well, that's really not the effective rate. The effective rate is lower. But I will just put on the record today, the effective rate is still 8 points higher than the OECD average. So I don't want folks to misinterpret what was said earlier when the point was made that our effective rate is lower because you could have inferred from that it's lower than the average. It's not. It's still higher. And as you have talked about today, and I think Senator Crapo discussed, this is incredibly complicated. Therefore, we don't have an efficient allocation of resources. Therefore, it's hurting jobs in this country. So I would just ask you, given that the President's Job Council has come out with a report that cutting the corporate rate in a deficit-neutral way would boost economic growth, given that Simpson-Bowles also said that, given that the Treasury 2012 white paper advocated cutting the corporate rate because it would, I quote, put the United States in line with other major competitor countries and encourage more investment in America, given that the OECD has now concluded that a high corporate tax rate is, quote, most harmful to growth. Would you agree that revenue-neutral tax reform that reduces our corporate rate is a competitive necessity for our country?
Senator, I very much agree that business tax reform, where we broaden the base and lower the rate, would be very important to getting our economy moving again.
And do you believe that reducing that corporate rate is good for workers? Let me just give you a little background from some of the studies that I've seen on this. The CBO has said that 70% of the corporate tax burden falls on workers. in the form of reduced wages, fewer jobs opportunities. There's a recent study by a Harvard economist saying that corporate taxes depress both real wages and returns to capital, most of the burden of corporate taxes being borne by labor. Would you agree that corporate tax system we have right now is bad for the American worker and that a corporate rate cut would be good for jobs and wages?
I think a reformed tax system with a lower rate that encouraged investment in the United States and creation of jobs in the United States would be good for American workers who would fill those jobs.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to talking about entitlement reform on
Forward to
the second
working
round.
together.
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator Brown.